The sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1887, casting long shadows across the endless expanse of red rock and sagebrush that stretched toward the horizon like a sea of desolation. The heat shimmered in waves that distorted the distant mesas, creating mirages that had fooled countless travelers into believing salvation lay just beyond the next ridge. In this unforgiving landscape, where death stalked every canyon and water was more precious than gold, legends were born from the bones of those who dared to challenge the desert's supremacy. Sarah Mitchell pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the general store in Tombstone, her heart pounding as she listened to the cruel laughter echoing from the saloon across the dusty street. Through the grimy window, she could see the silhouettes of men gathered around a table, their voices carrying on the evening breeze like the howls of coyotes. They were talking about him again, the man they called the Ghost Walker, the one whose very name sent shivers down the spines of hardened gunfighters and made decent folk cross themselves and whisper prayers. Hey there, friend. Before we dive deeper into this tale of the unforgiving frontier, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and join our community of Western story enthusiasts. And tell me, what city are you watching from tonight? I always love hearing from folks all across this great land of ours. The stories about Jacob Thorne had grown with each telling, transforming him from a man into something approaching mythology. Some said he had been a cavalry officer who had gone mad after watching his entire unit massacred by Apaches in the Dragoon Mountains. Others whispered that he was a former outlaw who had turned to bounty hunting after losing his family to a rival gang's revenge. The truth, as Sarah would soon discover, was far more complex and tragic than any of the tales spun by drunken cowboys and traveling merchants. What everyone agreed upon was that Jacob Thorne was dangerous. He moved through the desert like a specter, appearing without warning to collect bounties on wanted men, then vanishing back into the wasteland as if he had never existed at all. His face bore the scars of countless battles, a jagged line that ran from his left temple to his jaw, courtesy of an Apache war lance, and burn marks on his hands from a dynamite explosion that had claimed 3 outlaws and nearly taken his own life. His eyes, those who had seen them and lived to tell about it, claimed, were the color of winter storms, cold and gray, and utterly without mercy. The townspeople of Tombstone had learned to fear the sound of his horse's hooves on the main street, the distinctive clip-clop of his black stallion's iron shoes against the hard-packed earth. Children would run to their mothers when someone spotted the tall figure in the long duster coat riding into town, his hat pulled low over his face, and his rifle resting across his saddle horn like a promise of violence. Shopkeepers would hastily close their shutters, and even the oldest of the saloon girls would find urgent business elsewhere when Jacob Thorne came calling. But Sarah Mitchell had never seen him, had only heard the stories that grew more elaborate with each passing month. She was new to Tombstone, having arrived just 3 weeks earlier with her husband Thomas, a mining engineer who had been hired by the Consolidated Mining Company to assess the silver deposits in the nearby hills. They had come west from Philadelphia, drawn by the promise of adventure and the opportunity to build a new life in the territories. Thomas had painted romantic pictures of the frontier, speaking of wide-open spaces and the chance to make their fortune beneath the endless Arizona sky. The reality had proven far harsher than either of them had imagined. The heat was oppressive, the dust got into everything, and the constant threat of Apache raids kept everyone on edge. The mining camps were rough places, filled with desperate men who had little respect for law or decency. And Sarah had quickly learned to stay close to town whenever Thomas was away on his surveying expeditions. She had written letters to her sister back in Philadelphia, carefully editing out the worst details of their new life, not wanting to worry the family or admit that their grand adventure might have been a terrible mistake. It was on a Tuesday morning in late July when everything changed. Thomas had been scheduled to return from a 3-day survey of the Chiricahua foothills, but the sun had set without any sign of him or his small party of assistants. Sarah had spent the night pacing their small room above the boarding house, listening to every sound from the street below and hoping to hear the familiar jingle of his spurs on the wooden stairs. When dawn broke, with still no word, she knew something had gone terribly wrong. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Bill Hawkins, who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the lawlessness of his jurisdiction, had been sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. "Ma'am," he had said, removing his hat and running his fingers through his graying hair, "I'd like to help you, but I can't spare any men for a search party right now. We've got reports of rustlers hitting the ranches south of town, and there's been talk of Apache war parties moving through the Dragoons. Your husband's probably just delayed by the heat, or maybe had some equipment trouble. These survey jobs always take longer than expected." But Sarah knew Thomas better than that. He was methodical and careful, always planning for contingencies, and never taking unnecessary risks. If he said he would be back by Monday evening, he would move heaven and earth to keep that promise. The fact that he hadn't returned, hadn't even sent word, meant that something catastrophic had happened to him and his men. Desperate and running out of options, Sarah had swallowed her pride and approached some of the local ranchers and businessmen, begging them to organize a search party. Most had been polite, but firm in their refusal, citing the same concerns about Apache activity that the sheriff had mentioned. A few had been more blunt, suggesting that a tenderfoot mining engineer from back east had probably gotten himself lost or killed through his own inexperience, and that sending good men after him would only result in more casualties. It was old Pete Garrison, the grizzled owner of the livery stable, who had finally spoken the words that everyone else had been thinking, but were too polite to say aloud. "Ma'am," he had said, not unkindly, "if your husband's party ran into trouble out there in the desert, there's only one man in this territory who might be able to track them down and bring them back alive. But I don't reckon you'd want to deal with the likes of Jacob Thorne." The name had hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot, heavy with implications and unspoken warnings. Sarah had heard enough stories about the Ghost Walker to know that seeking his help would be like making a bargain with the devil himself. But as the hours passed and her desperation grew, she began to realize that Jacob Thorne might be her only hope of ever seeing her husband alive again. Finding him, however, proved to be nearly impossible. Thorne didn't maintain an office or a permanent residence in any of the towns scattered across the territory. He was a creature of the wilderness, as much a part of the desert landscape as the saguaro cacti and the red-tailed hawks that circled overhead. Some said he had a hideout somewhere in the Superstition Mountains. Others claimed he lived like an Apache, moving from waterhole to waterhole and sleeping under the stars. It was Maria Consuela, the Mexican woman who ran the boarding house where Sarah was staying, who finally provided the information she needed. Maria had lived in the territory for over 30 years, had seen it change from a lawless frontier to something approaching civilization, and she knew the stories and secrets that the newer arrivals could only guess at. "Señora Mitchell," she had said in her heavily accented English, crossing herself as she spoke. "You do not want to find this man. He is not like other men. The desert, it has taken his soul and left something else in its place. But if you must—" She had paused, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "There is a cantina in Bisbee, a place called El Coyote Rojo. The bartender there, he sometimes knows where to find the ghost walker. But señora, please, think carefully about what you are asking. Some prices are too high to pay, even for love." The ride to Bisbee had taken Sarah the better part of a day, traveling in a hired wagon with a nervous driver who kept glancing at the surrounding hills as if expecting to see Apache warriors emerging from behind every boulder. The town itself was smaller and rougher than Tombstone, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden shacks clustered around the copper mines that provided its reason for existence. The streets were unpaved and dusty, filled with Mexican laborers and hard-faced miners who stared openly at the well-dressed woman from back east. El Coyote Rojo was exactly the sort of establishment that Sarah's mother had warned her about in her letters about the dangers of frontier life. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies, and the conversations died away to suspicious whispers when she pushed through the batwing doors. The bartender, a heavy-set man with arms like tree trunks and scars that suggested a violent past, had looked her up and down with undisguised skepticism. "You're looking for the ghost walker?" he had asked, in a voice like gravel, not bothering to hide his amusement. "Lady, you sure you know what you're asking for? That man ain't the type to help damsels in distress. He's more likely to put a bullet in you than tip his hat." But Sarah had persisted, explaining about her missing husband and her growing desperation. Something in her voice, perhaps the genuine anguish that she couldn't quite conceal, had finally convinced the bartender to help her. He had given her directions to a place called Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge about 10 miles north of town, where Thorne was said to have been seen recently. "But lady," he had warned as she prepared to leave, "if you do find him, don't expect him to be grateful for the company. And whatever you do, don't try to get too close. The ghost walker don't like people much, and he's got a real short temper when it comes to folks who waste his time." Devil's Canyon had proven to be as forbidding as its name suggested, a slash in the red rock that seemed to have been carved by some ancient cataclysm. The walls rose nearly 100 feet on either side, creating a corridor of perpetual shadow that provided blessed relief from the blazing sun. Sarah had left her hired wagon at the canyon mouth, knowing that the narrow trail ahead was too treacherous for wheels, and had proceeded on foot despite the driver's protests and warnings about rattlesnakes and flash floods. She had been walking for nearly an hour, her dress already soaked with perspiration, and her feet aching in shoes that had never been designed for desert hiking, when she finally saw him. He was sitting motionless on a ledge about 30 feet above the canyon floor, so perfectly still that she might have mistaken him for a rock formation, if not for the glint of sunlight off the barrel of his rifle. Even from a distance, she could see that the stories about his appearance had not been exaggerated. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the desert sun, and there was something in his posture that suggested a predator at rest, dangerous even in repose. "That's far enough." His voice had echoed off the canyon walls, carrying clearly despite the distance between them. State your business, or turn around and ride out. I don't have time for tourists. Sarah had taken a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. Mr. Thorne, she had called back, her voice sounding small and fragile in the vast space of the canyon. My name is Sarah Mitchell. My husband is missing, and I need your help to find him. There had been a long silence, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the whisper of wind through the rocks. Then, with a movement so fluid it seemed almost supernatural, Jacob Thorne had risen from his perch and begun making his way down the canyon wall, using handholds and footholds that were invisible to Sarah's untrained eye. Within minutes, he was standing before her, and she could see why the stories about him had taken on such mythic proportions. He was indeed scarred. Beneath the hardness and the obvious capacity for violence, Sarah had glimpsed a deep and abiding pain, the kind of suffering that could only come from profound loss. Lady, he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow more intimidating than a shout. You've got no business being out here alone. This country will kill you just for the sport of it, and there ain't nobody around to hear you scream when it does. But Sarah had stood her ground, explaining about Thomas and his surveying party, about the 3 days that had passed without word, about the sheriff's refusal to organize a search. As she spoke, she had watched Thorne's face for any sign of sympathy or interest, but his expression had remained as impassive as carved stone. Mining engineer from back east, he had said when she finished, and there had been something like contempt in his voice. Probably got himself turned around in the heat and is wandering in circles somewhere, dying of thirst because he was too proud to admit he was lost. The desert's full of bones from men just like him. The casual cruelty of his words had stung Sarah more than she had expected, and she had felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, despite her determination to remain strong. Please, she had whispered, hating the desperation in her own voice. I'll pay you whatever you ask. I just need to know what happened to him. Thorne had studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to look right through her. Then, unexpectedly, his expression had softened slightly, and Sarah had caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before the desert had claimed him. $500, he had said finally. Half now, half when I bring back your husband or proof of what happened to him. And lady, you need to understand something right up front. I can't promise you're going to like what I find out there. The next morning had dawned clear and hot, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. Sarah had met Thorne at the edge of town as arranged, bringing with her a small bag of supplies and the $250 he had demanded as advance payment. She had also brought something else, a determination to accompany him on the search, despite his explicit instructions that she was to remain in Tombstone and wait for his return. Absolutely not, he had said when she announced her intention to ride with him. This ain't some Sunday picnic, lady. Where we're going, there's nothing but heat and rocks and things that want to kill you. You'd be dead before noon. But Sarah had been prepared for his objections, and she had arguments ready. Mr. Thorne, she had said, trying to keep her voice steady and reasonable, I know this country better than you think. I've been living here for 3 weeks, and I've learned to handle the heat. Besides, if something has happened to Thomas, I need to see it for myself. I need to know. The argument had continued for nearly an hour, with Thorne becoming increasingly frustrated and Sarah becoming increasingly determined. Finally, perhaps recognizing that she would simply follow him anyway if he refused to take her along, He had grudgingly agreed to let her accompany him, but only after extracting a promise that she would obey his orders without question and turn back immediately if he told her to. They had ridden out of Tombstone in the pre-dawn darkness, two unlikely companions heading into a landscape that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Thorn rode his black stallion with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, while Sarah followed on a sturdy mare that the livery stable owner had assured her could handle the rough terrain ahead. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build, Sarah had begun to understand why Thorn had been so reluctant to bring her along. The desert was indeed a hostile environment, filled with hidden dangers that could kill the unwary in a dozen different ways. Rattlesnakes coiled beneath rocks and in the shade of cacti, their presence announced only by the distinctive buzz of their warning rattles. Flash floods could turn a dry wash into a raging torrent in minutes, sweeping away anything in their path. And always there was the heat, a living thing that seemed to press down on them with malevolent intent, sapping their strength and clouding their judgment. But Thorn moved through this hostile landscape with the confidence of a man who had made peace with its dangers long ago. He knew where to find water in seemingly barren country, could read the signs that warned of approaching storms, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to navigate by landmarks that were invisible to Sarah's untrained eye. As they rode, he began to share some of his knowledge with her, perhaps recognizing that her survival might depend on it. "See that ridgeline up ahead?" he had said, pointing to a series of low hills that shimmered in the heat. "That's where your husband was supposed to be working. But if they ran into trouble, they wouldn't have stayed there. Men in distress always head for water, and the nearest reliable source is about 15 miles southeast, a spring called Agua Dulce that the Apaches have been using for centuries." They had reached the survey site by mid-afternoon, and what they found there had confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The camp was abandoned, with clear signs of a hasty departure. Equipment lay scattered across the ground, some of it valuable enough that no one would have left it behind voluntarily. Most ominously, there were dark stains on the rocks that could only have been blood, and the tracks around the camp told a story of violence and chaos. Thorn had dismounted and begun examining the scene with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had spent years reading the stories written in dust and stone. He studied the hoofprints and boot marks, noted the direction of the scattered equipment, and followed the blood trail to its source, behind a large boulder where someone had clearly made a desperate last stand. "Apache war party," he had said finally, his voice grim. "Maybe 8 or 10 warriors, armed with rifles as well as traditional weapons. Your husband's party put up a fight, but they were outnumbered and caught by surprise. Looks like they managed to get away, but at least one of them was wounded pretty badly." Sarah had felt her knees go weak at the confirmation of her fears, but she had forced herself to remain standing. Are they still alive?" Thorn had continued his examination of the tracks, following them away from the camp toward the southeast. "Hard to say for certain, but the sign suggests that at least some of them escaped the initial attack. The question is whether they made it to water before the Apaches caught up with them again." The trail had led them across increasingly rough terrain, through a maze of arroyos and rocky outcroppings that provided countless opportunities for ambush. As they rode, Thorn had explained the tactics that Apache war parties typically employed, how they would harry their victims for miles, picking them off one by one until exhaustion and despair made resistance impossible. "They're not just trying to kill," he had said, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape for signs of danger. "They're trying to break their spirits first, make them suffer. It's psychological warfare, and it's very effective against men who aren't used to this kind of fighting." As the afternoon wore on and the heat reached its peak, they had begun to find more evidence of the running battle that had taken place. A torn piece of cloth caught on a thorny bush, a brass button from a mining company uniform, drops of blood on the rocks that marked the passage of wounded men. Each discovery had been like a knife in Sarah's heart, but she had forced herself to continue, driven by the desperate hope that they might still find Thomas alive. It was near sunset when they finally reached Agua Dulce, the spring that Thorne had identified as the most likely destination for the fleeing survey party. The water bubbled up from deep underground, creating a small oasis of green in the midst of the Red Rock Desert. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a beautiful and peaceful place. But what they found there had transformed it into a scene from a nightmare. The bodies of Thomas's assistants lay scattered around the spring, their corpses already beginning to bloat in the heat. They had been mutilated in the Apache fashion, their scalps taken, and their bodies bearing the marks of torture that spoke of a slow and agonizing death. But Thomas himself was nowhere to be found, and Sarah had clung to the hope that he might have somehow escaped or been taken prisoner. Thorne had examined the scene with the same methodical care he had shown at the survey camp, but his expression had grown increasingly grim as he studied the evidence. Finally, he had straightened up and turned to face Sarah, and she had seen something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "Mitchell," he had said quietly, "I need you to stay here by the horses while I check something. Don't follow me, and don't look toward the rocks on the far side of the spring." But Sarah had already seen what he was trying to spare her from seeing. There, tied to a wooden stake that had been driven into the ground, was a figure that she recognized, despite the terrible things that had been done to it. Thomas had been tortured for hours before finally being allowed to die, and the sight of his mutilated body had sent Sarah to her knees, retching and sobbing, as the full horror of his fate crashed over her like a physical blow. Thorne had cut Thomas down and wrapped his body in a blanket, working with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. When he was finished, he had helped Sarah to her feet and guided her away from the spring. His touch surprisingly tender for a man with such calloused hands. "I'm sorry," he had said, and there had been genuine compassion in his voice. "No one should have to see something like that. But you needed to know the truth, and now you do." They had made camp that night, several miles from the spring, neither of them able to bear the thought of sleeping near the scene of such horror. Thorne had built a small fire and prepared a simple meal, but Sarah had been unable to eat, her stomach still churning from the shock of what she had witnessed. As the stars emerged overhead and the desert began to cool, she had finally found her voice. "Why?" she had asked, staring into the flames. "Why did they do that to him? He never hurt anyone. He was just trying to make a living." Thorne had been silent for a long time, his own gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice had been barely above a whisper. "Because they could. Because this is their land and we're the invaders. Because they've seen their people killed and their children taken, and they want us to feel the same pain they've felt. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable." The words had hung between them in the darkness, heavy with implications that Sarah was only beginning to grasp. She had come west with romantic notions about the frontier, but the reality was far more complex and brutal than anything she had imagined. This was not a land of noble savages and heroic pioneers, but a place where survival often depended on one's willingness to embrace violence and cruelty. "What happens now?" she had asked, finally. "Now we go back to Tombstone," Thorn had replied. "I'll help you make arrangements for your husband's burial, and then you'll take the next stage back east where you belong. This country has already taken enough from you." But as they had prepared to sleep, Sarah had found herself studying the man who sat across the fire from her. Despite his fearsome reputation and his obvious capacity for violence, Jacob Thorn had shown her nothing but kindness and consideration since they had found Thomas's body. He had shielded her from the worst of the horror, had comforted her in her grief, and had treated her with a respect that many so-called civilized men back east would never have shown. The next morning had brought new dangers in the form of an Apache war party that had been tracking them since they left Agua Dulce. Thorn had spotted the signs early: disturbed rocks, bent grass, the faint impression of unshod hooves in the dust, and had immediately changed their route, leading them through a series of narrow canyons and hidden valleys in an attempt to shake their pursuers. "How many?" Sarah had asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "6, maybe 7, Thorn had replied, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines above them. "The same bunch that killed your husband. Most likely. They're probably hoping to finish what they started." For hours, they had played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the labyrinthine landscape of the Chiricahua Mountains, with Thorn using every trick he had learned in his years as a bounty hunter to stay ahead of their pursuers. He led them through hidden passages that only someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain could have found, doubled back on their own trail to confuse the tracking, and used the natural acoustics of the canyons to mask the sound of their horses' hooves. But the Apaches were skilled trackers in their own right, and they had the advantage of fighting on familiar ground. As the day wore on, it became clear that they were slowly closing the distance, and Thorn had been forced to make increasingly desperate choices to stay ahead of them. It was late in the afternoon when they had finally been cornered in a box canyon with no way out except the way they had come in. The Apache warriors had positioned themselves at the canyon mouth, effectively trapping their quarry in a natural prison of red rock walls that rose nearly 200 feet on all sides. "End of the line," Thorn had said grimly, checking his weapons and counting his ammunition. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell. I should have gotten you out of here while I had the chance." But Sarah had surprised him by drawing a small derringer from her reticule, a weapon that her father had insisted she carry when she left Philadelphia. "I'm not going to die without a fight," she had said, and there had been steel in her voice that Thorn had not heard before. The battle that followed had been brief but intense, with Thorn's superior marksmanship and knowledge of cover and concealment giving them a temporary advantage over their attackers. But ammunition was limited, and the Apaches had time on their side. As the sun began to set and their bullets ran low, it had seemed that their situation was hopeless. It was then that Jacob Thorn had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of waiting for the inevitable end, he had told Sarah to stay hidden behind the rocks while he created a diversion that might give her a chance to escape. Before she could protest, he had stepped out into the open, his rifle blazing as he charged directly at the Apache positions. The move had been so unexpected and so audacious that it had caught the warriors completely off guard. Thorn had managed to break through their line and disappear into the maze of rocks and shadows beyond the canyon mouth, drawing their pursuit away from Sarah's hiding place. The sound of gunfire had echoed through the mountains for nearly an hour before finally falling silent, leaving Sarah alone in the gathering darkness, with no way of knowing whether her unlikely protector was alive or dead. She had waded through the night, huddled behind the rocks, with her derringer clutched in her trembling hands, listening to every sound and jumping at every shadow. When dawn finally broke, she had emerged from her hiding place to find the canyon empty except for the bodies of 2 Apache warriors that Thorn had killed during his desperate charge. The journey back to Tombstone had taken her 3 days, traveling on foot across terrain that seemed determined to kill her at every turn. She had run out of water on the 2nd day and had been reduced to sucking moisture from cactus pulp and morning dew. Her dress had been torn to shreds by thorns and rocks. Her face had been burned raw by the sun, and her feet had been bleeding inside her ruined shoes. It was on the 3rd day, when she had been stumbling through the desert in a delirium of thirst and exhaustion, that she had seen the rider approaching from the north. At first she had thought it was a mirage, another cruel trick played by her heat-addled mind. But as the figure drew closer, she had recognized the distinctive silhouette of Jacob Thorn on his black stallion. He had been wounded, with a bullet graze along his ribs and an arrow wound in his left shoulder. But he was alive, and he had come back for her. Without a word, he had lifted her onto his horse and given her water from his canteen, his touch as gentle as a mother's, as he tended to her injuries and exhaustion. "I thought you were dead," she had whispered against his chest as they rode toward Tombstone. "So did I," he had replied, and there had been something like wonder in his voice. "But I couldn't leave you out there alone. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, but I wasn't going to add that to the list." They had ridden in silence for a while, Sarah drawing strength from the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of the man who held her. As the familiar landmarks of civilization began to appear on the horizon, she had found herself dreading their arrival, knowing that it would mean the end of whatever strange bond had formed between them in the crucible of the desert. "What will you do now?" she had asked as the buildings of Tombstone came into view. "Same thing I've always done," Thorn had replied, but there had been less conviction in his voice than usual. "Hunt down bad men and collect the bounties. It's the only life I know." But Sarah had heard something else in his words, a loneliness that matched her own, and she had made a decision that would have shocked her family back in Philadelphia. "It doesn't have to be," she had said quietly. "There are other ways to live, other things to do with your life. You saved me, Jacob. You risked everything to bring me back alive, and that makes you a better man than most of the so-called respectable citizens I've known." The words had hung between them as they entered the town, and Sarah had felt Thorn's body tense with some internal struggle. She knew that she was asking him to abandon everything he had known, to turn his back on a life of violence and isolation in favor of something that neither of them could quite define. But she also knew that the man who had comforted her in her grief and risked his life to save her was worth saving in return. It was later that evening, as Sarah sat in the boarding house parlor, trying to compose a letter to her sister about Thomas's death, that she heard the familiar sound of boots on the wooden stairs. She looked up to see Jacob Thorne standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands and an expression of uncertainty on his scarred face. "Mrs. Mitchell," he had said formally, "I wanted to thank you for what you said earlier, about there being other ways to live. I've been thinking about it, and I believe you might be right." Sarah had set down her pen and turned to face him fully, her heart beating faster as she recognized the significance of the moment. "What are you saying, Jacob?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time for the ghost walker to disappear for good," he had replied, and there had been a tentative hope in his voice that she had never heard before. "I'm saying that maybe there's room in this territory for a man who wants to build something instead of just tearing it down. And I'm saying that if you're willing to take a chance on a broken-down bounty hunter with more scars than sense, I'd be honored to help you figure out what comes next." The proposal had been awkward and uncertain, delivered by a man who was more comfortable with violence than with vulnerability. But Sarah had heard the sincerity behind the words. She had also seen something in his eyes that reminded her of the man Thomas might have become if he had lived long enough to be tested by the harsh realities of frontier life. "Jacob," she had said, rising from her chair and crossing the room to stand before him, "I've learned something important out there in the desert. I've learned that a person's past doesn't have to define their future, and that sometimes the most unlikely people can become the most important ones in your life. If you're serious about changing, about becoming the man I believe you can be, then yes, I'm willing to take that chance." The transformation had not been easy or immediate. Jacob Thorne had spent too many years living by the gun to simply set it aside overnight, and there had been moments when the old patterns of violence and isolation had threatened to reassert themselves. But with Sarah's help and encouragement, he had gradually begun to build a new life, one based on creation rather than destruction. They had married 6 months later in a simple ceremony at the Tombstone Church, with half the town attending out of curiosity to see the legendary ghost walker take a bride. The other half had stayed away, still too frightened of Jacob's reputation to believe that he could truly change. But Sarah had never doubted her decision, even when well-meaning friends had warned her about the dangers of marrying a man with such a violent past. Together, they had established a small ranch in the foothills outside of town, raising cattle and horses on land that Jacob had purchased with the money he had saved from his bounty hunting days. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and there was something deeply satisfying about building something permanent in a land that had seen too much destruction. The ranch had prospered, and so had their marriage. Sarah had discovered that beneath Jacob's scarred exterior lay a man of surprising gentleness and intelligence, someone who could discuss literature and philosophy with the same passion he had once reserved for tracking outlaws. He had learned to read and write properly under her tutelage and had developed a love of books that rivaled her own. But it was the children who had truly completed Jacob's transformation from the ghost walker into the man Sarah had always believed he could become. Their first son, Thomas, had been born 2 years after their marriage, followed by a daughter they named Hope, and then another son they called Samuel. Watching Jacob with his children, seeing the wonder and tenderness in his eyes as he held them, Sarah had known that her faith in him had been justified. The years had passed peacefully, with only occasional reminders of Jacob's violent past to disturb their domestic tranquility. Sometimes former associates would ride up to the ranch, looking for the ghost walker, and finding instead a family man who was more interested in discussing cattle prices than bounty hunting. Most went away disappointed, but a few had tried to cause trouble, forcing Jacob to demonstrate that his skills with a gun had not entirely disappeared. It was during one such incident, when a gang of rustlers had threatened Sarah and the children while Jacob was away on business, that the full measure of his transformation had become clear. The old Jacob Thorne would have hunted down the rustlers and killed them all without a second thought. But the new Jacob had instead organized the local ranchers into a protective association, working with the sheriff to bring the criminals to justice through legal means rather than vigilante violence. "You've changed him," Maria Consuela had observed one day as she watched Jacob playing with his children in the yard outside the boarding house. The desert gave him back his soul, but Sarah had known better. The desert hadn't given Jacob anything. It had simply provided the crucible in which his true character could be revealed. The capacity for goodness had always been there, buried beneath years of pain and violence, waiting for someone to believe in it strongly enough to help it emerge. As she sat on the porch of their ranch house that evening, watching the sun set over the mountains that had once seemed so hostile and forbidding, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. She thought about Thomas, whose death had been the catalyst for everything that followed, and she felt a deep sadness for the life they might have had together. But she also felt a profound gratitude for the life she had found instead, and for the man who had emerged from the desert like a guardian angel to save her from despair. The sound of hoofbeats on the dusty road interrupted her reverie, and she looked up to see Jacob riding toward the house, his day's work finished, and his face lit with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world. Behind him rode their eldest son Thomas, now 15, and already showing signs of the strength and character that would make him a worthy heir to the Thorne name. "Evening, Mrs. Thorne," Jacob said as he dismounted, using the formal address that had become a private joke between them over the years. "How was your day?" "Peaceful," Sarah replied, rising to greet him with a kiss that still held all the passion and tenderness of their early days together. "Just the way I like it." As they stood together on the porch, watching their children play in the yard, while the desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, Sarah thought about the words she had spoken in Tombstone all those years ago, when people had mocked Jacob and called him a brute. She had defended him then, insisting that he was the one who had saved her from the desert. And time had proven her right in ways she could never have imagined. The ghost walker was gone, buried in the red dust of the Arizona Territory, along with all the pain and violence that had defined his existence. In his place stood Jacob Thorne, husband and father, rancher and respected member of the community, a man who had found redemption in the most unlikely of places and with the most unlikely of companions. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky above them, Sarah knew that their story was far from over. There would be new challenges ahead, new obstacles to overcome, but they would face them together, drawing strength from the love that had been forged in the crucible of the desert and tempered by the trials they had endured. The desert had taken much from both of them. Thomas's life, Jacob's innocence, their illusions about the nature of the frontier. But it had also given them something precious in return. It had given them each other, and the chance to build something beautiful and lasting in a land that had seemed capable of producing only death and destruction. "Don't mock him," Sarah whispered into the desert wind, remembering the words that had started it all. "Call him a brute if you must, but he's the one who saved me from the desert. And in the end, she thought, as Jacob's arms tightened around her. They had saved each other.